Hi, my name is Lauren Grissett Hinton, and I will be talking to you briefly about culture and emergency management. Culture plays an intricate role in disaster management preparation. While culture is something that should be taken into account everywhere, it's vital to do so in developing countries, where access to new technology and globalization are not as prominent. While there are numerous definitions of culture, the one that spoke to me the most was provided by Patricia Huddleston, author of an anthropological publication in the Oxford Journals. Patricia describes culture as a shared set of implicit and explicit values, ideas, concepts, and rules of behavior that allow a social group to function and perpetuate itself. When looking at culture as it relates to disaster management, there are several components emergency managers should consider: race, ethnicity, gender, socioeconomic status, age, religion, and language. In order to really understand disaster management relationships and culture, I've chosen to briefly address each cultural characteristic while illustrating its relationship and significance to emergency management. Socioeconomic status and emergency management. Socioeconomic status has a definite role in emergency management, as it does in most things. Access to funds and other means enable victims to flee risky situations, avoid hazards, and resume their normal lives after a disaster event more quickly, while those with less access are left behind to weather the storm, so to speak. It's not a secret that those with a high social, without a high social economic standing go without during a time of crisis. An obvious example of this would be Hurricane Katrina, where the bulk of its victims came from impoverished and minority backgrounds. Religion and emergency management. Religion, rituals, and beliefs impact the way people view and respond to situations. Emergency managers should be knowledgeable about certain communities that hold strong ties to a religious organization and be sensitive to the needs and belief systems of these individuals. It is also important to note that religious organizations are heavily responsible for lending assistance during disasters, providing volunteers, shelter, and spiritual guidance to those in need. These non-governmental organizations are needed participants, working with the local, state, and national governments to provide relief efforts to the community. Language and emergency management. While language is a part of one's ethnicity, I thought it important to zone in on its relationship to emergency management a little more closely. Essentially, language impacts how a message is perceived by an individual. As, as the U.S. is an extremely diverse nation, home to people from all over the world, it's very important that emergency managers take into account that English may not always be the first language spoken among the victims of a disaster event. In this, a strong effort should be made to disseminate information in a variety of ways. For example, providing written documents in various languages, and forming relationships with cultural community groups that work to inform and care for people in their native languages. Race, ethnicity, and emergency management. Race and ethnicity take into account a person's skin color, eye color, bone structure, language, and country of origin. The best way to describe how race and ethnicity come into play in regards to disaster management is in terms of social vulnerability, which refers to socioeconomic and demographic factors that affect a community. Racial and ethnic groups are typically more vulnerable at all stages of a disaster. This is especially true of recent immigrants or those living in communities in which English is not widely used. Age and emergency management. Children and the elderly are among the most at risk during a disaster event. These two groups are typically have life-sustaining needs that require constant care and attention. Children and babies have certain needs from breast milk or formula to diapering. They also lack the ability to care for themselves, as do some elderly. Other factors to consider for the elderly is the need for access to medications, possible mobility issues, and the likelihood of having complex health issues that require monitoring. Both the very young and very old are more susceptible to heat exhaustion and infectious disease. Gender and emergency management. According to UNICEF, up to 80% of internally displaced persons and refugees around the world are women and children. This coincides with natural calamities which disrupt society's traditional protection systems. Women and children are more vulnerable to abuse, rape, or sexual exploitation. During and after an emergency, UNICEF's focus is on meeting the basic needs of women and children, protecting their fundamental rights, and preventing human rights violations. As UNICEF's mandate is to ensure that emergency preparedness and response to disaster is undertaken in a gender equal manner. All emergency preparedness and response training in the region includes integration of gender issues and analysis. Disability and emergency management. While not listed as a characteristic of culture, some argue that disability should be considered a cultural competency. Individuals with disabilities, mental, social, and physical, require additional care, which should be taken into account during an emergent situation. Emergency managers need to keep this in mind during all phases of disaster response. According to the Department of Minority Health, cultural competency is defined as cultural and linguistic competence in a set of congruent behaviors, attitudes, and policies that come together in a system, agency, or among professionals that enables effective work in cross-cultural situations. Taking into account the characteristics of culture, as previously mentioned in my presentation, cultural competency is vital to the success of emergency managers. All of these factors can influence risk perception in victims, thus resulting in vulnerability. Cultural competency is an integral part and factor in the closing the gaps of disparities in disaster response. Emergency managers should strive to consider all of the characteristics of culture presented here in all stages of emergency response. I hope that you enjoyed learning about culture and emergency management. This concludes my presentation. Thanks so much for listening.